On Christmas Eve, I showed up unannounced. I found my son outside, freezing in the cold with no blanket. Inside, my daughter-in-law's family was laughing and drinking champagne by the fire. I burst in, holding him close, and had just these words. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Margaret. It was Christmas Eve. A time for warmth, for family, for peace. But as I drove through the snow-dusted suburbs, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and the peace I felt was the cold, hard peace a decision finally made. A mother's intuition is a formidable thing, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of everyday life. For months my son Leo's voice on the phone had been growing thinner, his laughter more brittle, the silences between his words more cavernous. Clarissa, his wife, would always assure me he was fine, just tired from work, or under the weather, her voice a symphony of concerned silk. But the hum of my maternal dread had become a deafening roar, and I could no longer ignore it. My late husband, Robert, a man who had built an empire on reading people, had always told me listen to the music, not the words, and the music coming from my son's life was a funeral dirge. So I had gotten in my car without calling, without announcing my arrival, a pilgrim on a desperate journey to the truth. The festive lights on the neighboring houses were a cruel mockery, each twinkling bulb a small, sharp reminder of the joy that felt a universe away. As I turned onto his street, I saw it, the grand, opulent home. Robert and I had gifted them a place that was supposed to be a castle for their family, looked cold and imposing under the winter moon. But it was not dark. The large bay window was a blaze of golden light, a perfect curated tableau of holiday cheer. I could see the flicker of a roaring fire, the silhouette of a towering Christmas tree, the movement of people within. I could almost hear the clinking of glasses and the sound of their laughter, a sound that felt obscene in the face of the cold certainty in my gut. I parked across the street, my heart a heavy frozen stone in my chest. I got out of the car, my boots crunching on the pristine snow, and then I saw him. My son. My Leo. He was huddled on a small wrought iron bench on the far side of the porch, tucked away in the shadows, almost invisible. He was not wearing a coat, only a thin gray sweater that was no match for the biting December wind. There was no blanket. He had his arms wrapped around himself, his shoulders shaking with a tremor that was only partly from the cold. His face, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, was pale and hollow, his eyes fixed on some distant, empty point in the darkness. He looked like a refugee, an exile, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life, just a few feet of frozen flagstone away from the warmth of his own home. Through the window I could see them. Clarissa, my daughter-in-law, was the radiant center of it all, a queen in her domain. She was wearing a red velvet dress, a champagne flute in her hand, her laughter bright and ringing as she spoke to her father, Bernard. Her family was all there, a constellation of smug, handsome faces, bathed in the warm glow of the fire. They were celebrating, a rage so pure, so glacial, it felt like it could crack my very bones. Rose up in me. It was not a hot, shouting rage. It was a cold, clarifying fury, a force that sharpened my senses and hardened my resolve. The time for quiet concern was over. The time for polite phone calls was over. This was no longer a family matter to be handled with delicacy. This was an extraction. I did not walk to the front door. I ran. I half carried my son to his feet. He seemed to look right through me, his eyes clouded with a fog of despair so thick I feared he might never find his way out. He was light, frighteningly so, as I put his arm around my shoulder and supported his shivering frame. I did not knock. I did not ring the bell. I burst through the front door. The laughter inside died instantly, replaced by a collective gasp of shocked, indignant silence. Every head turned. Clarissa's face, flushed with champagne and cheer, hardened into a mask of pure fury at my intrusion. She looked from me to the pathetic, shivering figure of her husband clinging to me, and her expression was not one of concern but of profound, theatrical annoyance, as if I had just tracked mud all over her clean floor. "Margaret," she began, her voice sharp with a proprietary anger. "What is the meaning of this? You are interrupting our family Christmas." I ignored her. I half carried my son into the center of the warm, opulent room, his shivering body a stark, tragic accusation in the heart of their celebration. I held him close to me, a human shield against their cold, stunned stares. My voice, when I spoke, did not shake. It was as cold and hard as the winter outside, each word a carefully placed stone, a piece of a legal fortress I was about to construct around them. The party is over, I said. As the sole trustee of the Leo Harding Family Trust, I am invoking Clause 17B of the bylaws, the well-being provision. You are all in violation. You are trespassing. A stunned, uncomprehending silence hung in the opulent room. The crackle and spit of the roaring fire was the only sound. Clarissa stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. Her family looked on, their expressions a mixture of confusion and haughty indignation. Her father Bernard, a large florid man with the smug assured bearing of someone who has never been told no in his life, was the first to recover. He let out a short dismissive bark of a laugh, a sound that dripped with condescension. Trustee? What is this nonsense? Clause 17B. You've been reading too many novels, Margaret. This is my daughter's house. Now I suggest you stop this hysterical scene and take your son upstairs. Is it Bernard? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I could feel Leo trembling against me, his weight a fragile, precious burden. Did you read the deed of gift before your daughter hung her expensive, tasteless curtains? Or did you simply assume, as you have with everything in life, that it belonged to you by association? Clarissa found her voice then, a sneer twisting her beautiful, cruel face. Mother Margaret, you're confused, she said, her tone dripping with a condescending pity that was more insulting than a shout. You've clearly had a senior moment. You have no authority here. Now I suggest you take Leo upstairs so the adults can continue their evening. I looked at her, at the daughter-in-law I had welcomed into my family, the woman I had tried for Leo's sake to love, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary disgust. I had spent years watching her subtly undermine my son, chipping away at his confidence with 1,000 small cuts, but I had always held my tongue respecting the sanctity of their marriage. That sanctity was now a smoking ruin. My authority, I said, my voice as clear and unyielding as a court order, is absolute, and my memory is perfectly intact. I remember every word of the trust my late husband and I established. A trust, Clarissa, that you have clearly never bothered to read. I let my gaze sweep over their stunned, arrogant faces. Let me educate you. This house, the 2 luxury cars in the garage, the portfolio of stocks that funds your shopping trips and your little brother's gambling habits, none of it belongs to Leo, and it certainly does not belong to you. It is all the property of the Harding Family Trust. I paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. I saw a flicker of genuine alarm in Bernard's eyes. He, at least, understood the language of money and power. My husband was a brilliant man, I continued, my voice a quiet lecture. He was also a man who did not suffer fools. He structured the trust to protect our son's legacy from predators. My eyes rested on Clarissa for a fraction of a second too long. Leo is the beneficiary. Yes, but I am the sole trustee, and the bylaws contain a very specific non-negotiable provision, Clause 17B, the well-being provision. I looked directly at Clarissa, my eyes holding hers. It states that if, in the sole judgment of the trustee, the primary beneficiary is found to be in a state of physical, emotional, or psychological distress, particularly if that distress is deemed to be caused by the actions or neglect of his spouse, the trustee has the absolute right and responsibility to immediately restrict all access to trust assets and properties. You see, Robert always believed that a man who is not well enough to care for himself is certainly not well enough to manage a fortune. I gently rubbed my son's back, his shivering starting to subside in the warmth of the room, leaving my son to freeze on his own porch while you and your family drink champagne inside, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper, is what a lawyer might call a flagrant and unambiguous violation of that clause. The color drained from Clarissa's face, the arrogance, the sneer, it all melted away, replaced by a dawning, panicked horror. She finally understood. The power she thought she had, the control she wielded over my son, was all an illusion. She was not a queen in her castle, she was a guest in my house, and her stay was over. You have 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate this property, I stated, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. The silence was broken by Bernard's furious blustering. This is outrageous. I'll call my lawyer. We'll sue you for everything you have. Clarissa, her face a mask of pure murderous rage, screamed at me. You can't do this, you hateful old witch. You can't throw me out of my own home. Her brother Tristan, a boorish young man who had been watching the scene with a look of smug amusement, took a step towards me. Now listen here, old lady. I ignored them all. I took out my phone, a simple old-fashioned flip phone, and pressed a single speed dial button. A calm professional voice answered immediately. Blackwood Security. This is Margaret Harding, I said. Code Onyx. I have a situation at my son's residence. I need a two-man team here, immediately. They are 5 minutes out, Mrs. Harding, the voice replied. As per your standing instructions. I hung up. I had activated the private security firm my husband had insisted we keep on retainer years ago, a precaution I had always thought was an extravagance. Now it felt like the wisest money we had ever spent. The threat of a lawsuit was met with the immediate tangible reality of two large imposing men in dark coats who appeared at the front door precisely 3 minutes later. They were polite, professional, and utterly immovable. They did not speak to Clarissa or her family. They simply stood a silent human wall waiting to escort them out. The reality of the situation finally brutally sank in. Their power was gone. The game was over. The expulsion was a scene of chaotic, undignified haste. Bernard, his face purple with rage, sputtered threats he could no longer back up. Clarissa's mother, Eleanor, who had been a silent, disapproving statue throughout the confrontation, was now weeping hysterically. Tristan, the bully, seemed to shrink in the presence of the security guards, his earlier aggression evaporating into a sullen silence. And Clarissa. She was a whirlwind of impotent fury, grabbing a fur coat from the closet, her movements jerky and violent. As she was ushered towards the door, she turned to me one last time, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. You will regret this, she spat. I will destroy you. I will destroy him. I will take everything. You have nothing to take, dear, I replied, my voice quiet. You never did. The security guards escorted them out into the cold night, a sad, furious parade of usurpers dethroned. I watched from the doorway as they piled into their expensive cars the trust owned, and sped away, their Christmas Eve party ending in a humiliating, ignominious rout. I closed the heavy oak door, the sound of the lock clicking into place a definitive final punctuation mark on the end of an era. I turned and leaned against it, the adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins finally beginning to recede, leaving me feeling shaky and profoundly weary. The grand, opulent room was a wreck. Half-empty glasses of champagne sat on every surface, a plate of expensive canapés lay abandoned on the coffee table, and the roaring fire which had warmed my son's tormentors now seemed to mock the sudden echoing silence of the house. And in the center of it all, my son Leo had sunk into a large armchair. He was wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket I had found in the hall closet, but he was still trembling, not from the cold but from the shock. He stared into the flames, his face a blank, empty mask of a man who had been pushed far beyond his limits. He looked like a soldier in the immediate deafening aftermath of a battle, unsure if he had survived, unsure of what came next. I didn't know what came next either. I had won the first decisive battle. I had reclaimed the territory, but the war, I knew, was far from over. For now there was only this, the quiet, the warmth, and the immense, heartbreaking task of tending to my broken child. The first night in the reclaimed house was a quiet ritual of care. I did not bombard Leo with questions or try to force him to talk. The words would come when they were ready. For now my only job was to perform the simple, ancient tasks of a mother tending to her child, to create an environment of such profound safety that the splintered parts of his spirit might feel it was safe to begin to knit themselves back together. I led him upstairs to the guest room, a calm, neutral space untouched by Clarissa's cold, modern aesthetic. The walls were a soft cream, the furniture old, solid cherry wood from my own home. It was a room that smelled of beeswax and old books, a room that held no memory of his torment. I ran a hot bath for him, adding Epsom salts to soothe his aching, chilled muscles. While he soaked, I went to the kitchen and made him a simple bowl of tomato soup from a recipe my own mother had made for me when I was sick, and I grilled a cheese sandwich, cutting it into triangles, just as I had when he was a boy. He ate in silence, his movements slow and robotic, as if he were a puppet whose strings had been cut. He seemed to have shrunk, the confident, successful man he had once been, now hidden beneath a fragile shell of trauma. After he had eaten, I gave him a mild sleeping pill from a bottle I kept for my own sleepless nights, and I sat in a chair by his bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest until he was deeply asleep. Only then did I allow myself to truly survey the battlefield. The house felt like an occupied territory, a beautiful, opulent prison built by Clarissa. Every room was a testament to her cold, materialistic taste. There were no family photos on the walls, only large, abstract, and aggressively impersonal art. The furniture was all sharp angles and unforgiving surfaces of glass and steel. It was not a home, it was a showroom, a stage set for a life designed to impress, not to comfort. I spent the next few hours reclaiming the space, turning it from his prison into our sanctuary. I was not just cleaning, I was performing a kind of exorcism. I went into their master bedroom, a vast sterile room that felt like a luxury hotel suite. I gathered all of Clarissa's things, her expensive clothes that smelled of her cloying perfume, her rows upon rows of designer shoes that clicked menacingly on the hardwood, her countless bottles and jars of expensive creams that promised eternal youth. I packed them not with care but with a cold efficiency into her many suitcases. I then carried them one by one to the garage and stacked them against the wall, a cold, unceremonious pile of her discarded life. I went through the house and removed every trace of her and her family. I took down the cold art and replaced it with warm, familiar landscape paintings from my own home that I had the foresight to bring with me. I went to my car and retrieved a box of photographs. I placed pictures of Leo as a happy, gap-toothed boy, of our whole family in happier times, of him and his father Robert on a fishing trip, on the mantelpiece and the side tables. I was repopulating the house with love, with memory, with his own history. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, the house was transformed. The fire was roaring in the hearth again, but this time it felt welcoming, not mocking. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. The house was still grand, but it was beginning to feel like a home again. It was beginning to feel like his home. The counterattack began, as I knew it would, just after noon. My phone, which I had placed on the kitchen counter, buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message, when I listened to it, was from Clarissa. Her voice was no longer the screeching fury of the night before, but a cold reptilian hiss, a sound far more dangerous. "Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous calm. "You have made the biggest mistake of your life. My father has already spoken to his lawyers. We are going to sue you for everything you have. We are going to take the house, the trust, the very clothes off your back. You think you've won? You've just started a war you have absolutely no chance of winning." An hour later, an email arrived. It was from a high-powered law firm in the city, a firm known for its aggressive, scorched earth tactics. The email was a formal notice of intent, a dense, intimidating document filled with legal jargon. It accused me of illegal eviction, assault, slander, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. It threatened an immediate, multi-million-dollar lawsuit. It was designed to terrify, to bully me into submission. I read it, and I felt nothing but a weary resolve. I forwarded it to my own lawyer, Benjamin Carter, with a simple two-word message: as expected. I knew I needed to understand how Leo had fallen so far, how he had become a prisoner in his own home. The answer, I suspected, lay in his office. It was a room he had been so proud of when they first moved in, a handsome wood-paneled space where he had planned to build his new consulting business. When I opened the door, it was clear he hadn't used it in months. It was dusty and cold, and Clarissa had turned it into a storage room for her overflowing collection of shopping bags and designer boxes, a monument to her own rampant consumerism. In the corner, tucked behind a stack of hat boxes, I found a single dusty cardboard box. It was filled with Leo's things, his dreams packed away and forgotten. I sat on the floor and went through it. There was the business plan he had been so excited about, his optimistic projections and hopeful mission statements, now a heartbreaking testament to his ambition. And beneath it, the story of his failure. A stack of letters from creditors, each one more threatening than the last. A final formal notice of bankruptcy. His business, his dream, had collapsed 6 months ago. And then I found something more sinister. Tucked into the bottom of the box was a thick stack of his personal mail. All of it unopened. There were letters from his brother, David. There were birthday cards from his old college friends. There were 3 letters from me. Letters I had written after he had missed our weekly calls. Letters I had thought he had simply been too busy to answer. Clarissa hadn't just watched him fall. She had actively, systematically cut his lifelines. She had isolated him from his entire support network, ensuring that her voice was the only one he heard, her narrative of his failure the only story he was told. I sat on the floor of that cold, dusty room, holding the proof of her monstrous cruelty in my hands, and I wept. I wept for my son's broken dreams, for his profound loneliness, for the masterful psychological prison she had built around him, brick by loving brick. For 3 days after the expulsion, Leo remained in a state of deep, quiet shock. He ate what I put in front of him, He slept for long, unnerving stretches of time, and he stared into the fire, his eyes vacant, as if he were watching a movie only he could see. I did not push him. I knew from my own experience with grief that the soul has its own timetable for healing. My role was simply to be present, a calm, steady anchor in the storm of his trauma. I read in the chair opposite him. I put on the classical music he had always loved, and I simply sat with him in the quiet, letting the house itself, now cleansed of Clarissa's presence, begin its slow work of healing. Then on the fourth day the dam broke. I found him in his home office, the room I had cleared of Clarissa's clutter and restored to its former state. He was sitting at his large oak desk, holding the box of his failed dreams in his hands. He was not crying, but his face was a mask of such profound, hopeless shame that it was almost more painful to witness. "She was right," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was terrifying to behold. "Everything she said about me, it was all true. I'm a failure, Mom. I lost everything. I was a burden. I deserved it. I deserved to be out there in the cold." This was the heart of the poison she had fed him. Not just that he had failed, but that his failure defined him, that it made him worthless, that he deserved to be punished for it. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I knew my real work began. I pulled up a chair and sat opposite him. I did not offer him easy platitudes. I offered him the truth. "No, Leo," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You are not a failure. You are a man who had a business that failed. There is a profound difference. Your father, a man most people considered a titan of industry, had two businesses that failed spectacularly before he built his empire. He used to say that failure is not the opposite of success. It is a part of it. It is the tuition we pay for a real education." He shook his head, unable to accept the distinction. "I lost all our money, her money." "It was never her money, Leo," I said, my voice sharp with a sudden anger. "It was trust money, money that was given to you as a resource, not as a weapon to be used against you. And Robert, your father set up that trust knowing that business is a risk. He built a contingency for failure into the very fabric of our finances. What he did not build a contingency for was cruelty. That is a variable he never would have tolerated." He finally began to talk then, the words tumbling out in a torrent of shame and pain, a confession that felt like it had been held back for months. He told me about the collapse of his business, the crushing depression that had followed, the way he had felt paralyzed by a sense of worthlessness that was deeper than any financial debt, and he told me how Clarissa had expertly, masterfully used his vulnerability against him. She had started by feigning support, her voice full of a sweet, false sympathy. Then came the small, cutting remarks, the constant reminders of his failure, disguised as helpful advice. She had taken over their finances, to take the burden off him, a move he now realized was designed to disempower him completely. She had begun to control who he saw, who he spoke to, convincing him that his friends and family would be disappointed in him, that it was better not to see them until he was back on his feet. She had slowly, methodically convinced him that his depression was not an illness, but a moral failing, a weakness that was making her life unbearable. She said I was sucking the joy out of the house, he whispered, his face buried in his hands. She said I was a black cloud, a weight on her and her family. She started having her family over more and more, and I was just the ghost at the feast. Then she started asking me to stay in the office when they were here. Then to stay upstairs. And then, a few weeks ago, she said the sight of me was just too depressing for her on a festive occasion. She said it would be better for everyone if I just stayed outside. And the worst part, Mom, he looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears of shame, is that I believed her. I actually believed I deserved to be there. It was a horrifying confession, a textbook case of coercive control and psychological abuse. He had not been locked out of his house. He had been convinced to lock himself out, to accept his own banishment as a just and fitting punishment for his failure. I didn't try to argue with his feelings. I simply listened, letting him pour out all the poison she had filled him with. When he was finished, a deep, shuddering silence filling the room, I reached out and took his hand. "Your business failed, Leo," I said softly. "That is a fact, but Clarissa did not fail you. She betrayed you. There is a difference. Your failure was a circumstance, her betrayal was a choice, and you are not responsible for the choices she made." His confession, as painful as it was to hear, was the first crucial step on his long road back to himself. The poison was finally being drawn out into the light. The spell she had woven around him, a dark, intricate tapestry of his own shame and her ambition, was beginning to break. Our new life in the reclaimed house settled into a quiet, therapeutic routine. The days were about healing. I cooked for Leo, simple, nourishing meals from his childhood. We took long, silent walks in the snowy woods behind the house. We talked, not about Clarissa, not about the future, but about the past, about happier times, about his father. I was trying to rebuild the foundations of his self-worth, to remind him of the strong, capable and deeply loved man he had been before Clarissa had systematically dismantled him. But while our days were about healing, my nights were about war. I had assembled my team, and we were preparing for the legal onslaught Clarissa had promised. My first and most important call had been to Benjamin Carter, my late husband's estate lawyer. Ben was a lion in winter, semi-retired but still possessing one of the sharpest, most ruthless legal minds in the country. He had drafted Robert's trust, and he viewed the document with a fierce paternal pride. He had also, I knew, always disliked Clarissa, seeing in her the same grasping, empty ambition he had seen in countless corporate raiders he had defeated in court. When I explained the situation on Christmas morning, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard him let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "Margaret," he said, and I could hear the old fire in his voice. "Robert always told me this clause was a work of art. I never thought I'd get to see it used in my lifetime. It would be my distinct pleasure to dismantle these vultures." Ben flew in from his home in Florida, and we met at my new command center, Leo's dining room table. We spread out the trust documents, the threatening emails from Clarissa's lawyers, and we began to plan our counteroffensive. Ben, with his sharp strategic mind, was in his element. He was a general surveying the battlefield, and his excitement was a strange, grim comfort to me. "They're coming at you with a standard illegal eviction and emotional distress suit," Ben said, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. He pushed his glasses down his nose. "It's aggressive, but it's flimsy. Their entire case rests on the idea that Clarissa was a co-owner of the property. She was not. She was a resident, contingent on her marriage to the beneficiary. The trust is an ironclad legal fortress, Margaret. They can't touch it." "I don't want to just defend Ben," I said, my voice firm. "I want to end this. I want her gone from our lives for good. I want to make sure she can never ever do this to another person again." "Good," he said with a grim smile. "Because defense is boring. Let's go on the attack. Let's make them regret the day they ever heard the name Harding." Our first move was decisive and designed to inflict maximum psychological and financial damage. On Ben's advice, we targeted the very source of Clarissa's power, her lifestyle. Ben drafted a series of formal notices, each one a perfectly legal, perfectly brutal turn of the screw. The first went to the bank that held the credit cards Clarissa used so extravagantly. The cards were not in her name, they were subsidiary cards on a corporate account held by the trust. We canceled them, effective immediately. The second notice went to the dealership that leased her luxury SUV. The lease was also in the name of the trust. We terminated it, demanding the immediate return of the vehicle. We sent similar notices to the exclusive country club she belonged to and the high-end salon she frequented, informing them that the trust would no longer be covering her membership or her accounts. We were not just cutting her off. We were methodically stripping her of the symbols of the wealth and status she worshipped. We were showing her that the power she thought she had was entirely borrowed, and that the lender me was now calling in the debt with interest. The reaction was immediate and predictable. A screeching, hysterical voicemail from Clarissa filled with threats and curses. It was the sound of a queen who had just had her crown unceremoniously repossessed from her head. She was learning, for the first time in her pampered life, that actions have consequences. While Ben was handling the legal and financial front, I was focused on the personal one. I needed more than just a strong legal case. I needed to build a moral case against her, one that would be so damning she would have no choice but to retreat. That was when the call came. It was from a young woman named Emily, who identified herself as Clarissa's former personal assistant. She had quit 2 months ago, she explained, after witnessing a particularly cruel argument in which Clarissa had belittled Leo, calling him a worthless charity case in front of several of her friends. "I heard what happened on Christmas Eve," Emily said, her voice a mixture of nervousness and righteous anger. "And I couldn't stay silent. The way she treated him, it was monstrous. She's been planning to leave him for months. She was just waiting for his business to fail so she could paint him as an unfit, unstable provider and take everything in the divorce." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a spontaneous act of cruelty on Christmas Eve. This was a premeditated plan. Emily had evidence. She had been so disgusted by Clarissa's behavior that she had, for her own protection, kept copies of text messages and emails. A digital trail of Clarissa's contempt for my son. She had messages to her mother, Eleanor, mocking Leo's depression. She had messages to her brother, Tristan, bragging about her plan to break him so she could gain full control of the old witch's money. My money. It was a treasure trove of malice, a written record of her conspiracy. Emily, a decent young woman who had been pushed too far, agreed to provide a sworn affidavit and to testify if needed. The noose I had been weaving was tightening, and Clarissa, in her arrogance, had handed me the rope herself. Armed with this new, devastating evidence, Ben Carter drafted our ultimatum. It was a simple, brutal document, a masterpiece of legal threat assessment. We delivered it not to Clarissa but to her lawyer, a man who, Ben assured me, would understand the gravity of the situation and would be legally obligated to present it to his client. The letter laid out our two options for his client. Option A. She would immediately and unconditionally drop her frivolous lawsuit. She would agree to a quiet, uncontested divorce, the terms of which would be dictated by us. The settlement would be the bare legal minimum required by the state. Enough for her to start a new life, but not enough to fund the one she had been accustomed to. She would sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, ensuring she would never speak of our family again. In exchange, we would not pursue our own legal action. Option B. We would proceed to discovery. We would reject any and all settlement offers. We would file our own multi-million-dollar civil suit against her for fraud, conspiracy, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. We would submit Leo's harrowing, detailed testimony of the abuse he suffered, and we would release the entirety of her text messages and emails, the ones provided by her former assistant, to the court and subsequently to the press. We would not just defeat her in court, we would annihilate her in the court of public opinion. We would make her name a byword for a particular kind of monstrous socialite cruelty. We gave her lawyer 48 hours to respond. It was a declaration of total war, and we had just unleashed our entire arsenal. We were offering her a choice between a quiet, dignified retreat and complete and utter annihilation. The choice was hers. The 48 hours passed in a state of tense, suspended animation. Clarissa's lawyer, a man clearly unprepared for the level of organized, ruthless opposition he was facing, called Ben Carter's office a dozen times, attempting to negotiate, to bluff, to find a weakness in our position. Ben was a stone wall. He was a master at this kind of psychological warfare. He took only one of the calls. He listened patiently to the lawyer's blustering and then simply said, "Your client has two options. The clock is ticking," and hung up. Finally, on the second day, the lawyer conceded. His client, he said, was willing to meet. She still had conditions, demands, but she was willing to come to the table. Ben agreed, but only on our terms. The meeting would take place at his office, a neutral territory. There would be no negotiation on the core terms, and Leo would be there. It was my one non-negotiable condition. Clarissa needed to face the man she had so cruelly broken. The day of the meeting, I drove Leo to the sterile downtown law office. He was quiet, his face pale but resolute. The past few weeks of safety and support had worked a small miracle. The fog of his depression was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet, simmering anger and a new, fragile sense of self-worth. He was no longer the catatonic man from Christmas Eve. He was a survivor, ready to confront his tormentor. He was wearing a new suit I had bought for him, and he looked not like a victim but like a man reclaiming his dignity. We were shown into a large, impersonal conference room, with a long, polished table. We sat on one side, Ben Carter at the head. A few minutes later, Clarissa and her lawyer were shown in. She was dressed in a severe black suit, her face a mask of defiant arrogance, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the dark circles that her expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. The Queen was without her castle, without her credit cards, without her coven of a family to support her. She was alone, and she was cornered. She refused to look at Leo. She addressed all her comments to Ben, as if my son were not even in the room. Her lawyer began to speak, outlining their counteroffer. It was a laughable attempt at a negotiation, a list of demands for a larger settlement, for a stake in the house, for continued access to the lifestyle she had forfeited. I let her speak. I let her lawyer drone on for a full 10 minutes. I let them lay all their useless cards on the table. My own expression was one of polite, slightly bored interest. Then, When they were finished, Ben Carter slid a single thick, spiral-bound document across the conference table. It landed in front of Clarissa with a soft, definitive thud. "This," Ben said, his voice calm and deadly, "is a summary of our case against you should you choose to reject our client's very generous offer. I suggest you read it carefully." I watched her face as she opened it. The first page was a sworn affidavit from Leo, a harrowing first-person account of the months of systematic psychological abuse he had endured. The next pages were sworn statements from his friends, whose letters and calls had been intercepted. Then came the evidence from her former assistant, Emily. Printed, in full color, were the pages of her own words, her vile, contemptuous text messages. "Just have to break him completely," one text to her mother read. "Then the old witch's money is all ours." The arrogance finally irrevocably crumbled. The defiant mask melted away, revealing the pathetic, grasping and terrified person underneath. She stared at the pages, her face ashen, her hands trembling. She had been so certain of her own cleverness, so dismissive of us, that she had never once imagined that her own words could be used to destroy her. She finally looked up, not at me, but at Leo. Her eyes were wide with a desperate, pleading look, the last gambit of a failed manipulator. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking, "please, we can work this out. Don't let them do this to me." And my son, the man she had called a worthless failure, the man she had left to freeze in the cold, found his voice. He looked at her and his expression was not one of hatred, not one of anger, but one of quiet, profound pity. "No, Clarissa," he said, his own voice steady and clear, "there's nothing left to work out. You made your choice a long time ago. This is just the consequence." There was no dramatic shouting match. There was no theatrical meltdown. There was only the quiet, bitter scraping of a pen on paper. As she signed the divorce agreement accepting every single one of our terms, she left the office without another word, without a backward glance, a queen who had lost her kingdom, her dignity and her soul in a single devastating checkmate. 1 year later it was Christmas Eve again. The grand opulent house on the hill had been sold, its cold marble halls now the domain of strangers. The proceeds, as per the trust, had been reinvested, the capital preserved for a future Leo would now build for himself. The past had been liquidated. Our new beginning was in a smaller, cozier home, a handsome craftsman house on a tree-lined street that we had chosen together. The air was not filled with the forced, brittle laughter of a party, but with the quiet, contented murmur of a family that had been through the fire and emerged scarred but whole on the other side. Leo was at the hearth, stoking the flames of a cheerful, crackling fire. He was a different man from the hollowed-out shell I had rescued a year ago. The road to recovery had been long and arduous, filled with therapy and difficult days, but he was healing. He had started a new, smaller consulting business from his home office. A venture built not on reckless ambition but on his own talent and a newfound hard-won humility. His laughter was genuine again, his eyes clear and full of a quiet strength I had not seen in years. He was not fully healed, perhaps, but he was no longer broken. He was rebuilding. He stood up and came over to where I was sitting in my favorite armchair, a cup of hot cider in my hands. The room was filled with the scent of gingerbread and the fresh, clean aroma of a pine tree he and I had cut down ourselves. He handed me a small, simply wrapped gift. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that needed no further explanation. I opened it. Inside was a simple silver locket. I clicked it open. On one side was a tiny photograph of Robert, his familiar, kind smile looking out at me. On the other side was a new picture of a smiling, confident Leo, his arm around my shoulders. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, his hand resting on my shoulder, "for everything. You didn't just save me from the cold, you saved my life." I took his hand in mine, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. "You saved your own life, Leo," I said, my voice soft. "You found your way back from a very dark place. You just needed a little help remembering the path." We sat together by the fire, the ghosts of the past finally banished into the cold winter night. The victory was not in Clarissa's defeat, not in the reclamation of our fortune. The victory was here, in this quiet, peaceful room, in the simple, unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. It was the quiet, powerful triumph of a love that had refused to let go, the beginning of a new, more honest chapter, written not in anger but in hope.